Hey everyone, welcome to part 2 of the 4-part video series, Banyan's PMP Primer. In this part, we're going to focus on traditional predictive waterfall project management. Now you might be saying, well, wait a second, I thought we were going to cover the next domain, the people or the process domain. We will, trust me, right? But it's important to understand that people and process will touch on both traditional project management and agile project management. So if we tried to address just people, for example, we will be jumping back and forth between traditional project management and agile project management, and it might get a little confusing if you didn't have a firm understanding of the framework for traditional project management or the framework for agile. So in topics 2 and 3, we're going to focus on first traditional project management and the people process components there, and then in topic 3 we will focus on agile project management and the people and process aspects in agile. By staying with each methodology, you can get a comprehensive understanding of the framework and kind of see how people and process are baked into those frameworks. And so it's not as confusing. And a lot of PMP courses now, they kind of throw you in there and they're jumping back and forth between agile and traditional project management, and it's very difficult to figure out where you are. So we're going to kind of stay with topic 2. We're going to stay with traditional waterfall predictive project management. We'll speak to that, give you a good understanding of how the important things you need to know there, and then in topic 3 we'll graduate to agile. We'll cover that so you have a really good understanding of the agile process, the roles in agile, why they're different from traditional project management roles, and that should set you up. So with that, let's get started on topic 2, focusing on traditional predictive waterfall project management. So when you start the process, you either have a business case or a statement of work that kind of initiates or kicks off the project. Once the business case or statement of work is approved or agreed to, then you can start into the initiating process where you create your project charter and you identify your stakeholders. And so that starts planning, and in planning, as we've talked about before, you plan the work and you refine the project objectives. You compile the project management plan. So you've got your charter coming from the initiating process group, flowing into planning. It's a high-level document that in planning you will build that project charter out into a detailed project management plan. And so a little bit later we'll show you what the components of the project management plan are, but all of that is developed in planning, and that becomes a roadmap for your executing processes. Executing is about doing the work. Monitor controlling then comes along, and monitor controlling is measuring your performance in all areas of the project, and we talked about that earlier. And then once all the work is done, you move into closing. And you can see in closing, I'll repeat this again later, but you verify the scope items are complete, you release resources, and you perform lessons learned, and you store project documentation away. Now, keep in mind that these 5 process groups are performed in every phase. If you have phases in your project, you usually have a larger project, probably there's more money involved, and so to establish and maintain more control over that project, you'll break the project up into phases. And at the end of each phase, you'll have one or more significant deliverables, and in between those phases, you'll have what we call phase gates or end gates. Sometimes they call them kill points. And it's where you'll end the phase, you'll evaluate the results and determine whether you need to go to the next phase or not. Sometimes projects end at the phase gate because marketplace conditions have changed, the product is no longer viable, and so there's no reason to move on to the next phase. Organizations will look and say, well, it looks like, for example, our internal rate of return has decreased to the point where this is no longer as profitable as it was when you originally wrote the business case for this. And so we have other project opportunities that have a better return on investment, a better internal rate of return, And so we're going to transition our resources over to those projects that are more profitable for our organization. So that can happen. And that's why we introduce phase gates into our projects. So we have those stopping points where we can stop, take a breath, review where we are, and determine should we continue in the project or not. It's important to understand that the 5 process groups that we just described occur in each phase of the project. You can have a single phase project, right? Simple project, not a lot of money involved, not a long timeline. You just want to initiate, plan, execute, monitor, control, and close. That's fine. But for the larger projects, they tend to want to have a little bit more control. They don't want to have that conversation where you said, well, wow, we should have stopped about $13 million ago, right? That's not a pleasant conversation. And to prevent that kind of situation, you introduce phase gates to where you stop and can evaluate and determine whether you should continue or not. Now, one of the documents is what we call the process matrix because it's in a kind of a table format. And this includes all of the 49 processes. Now, you've got these 49 processes also in the process map that we're going to cover, but this one kind of shows you that the 49 processes are organized according to the process groups, which you can see across the top. And they're also organized by what we call knowledge areas. The knowledge areas are also listed on the left side of this diagram. So there are 10 knowledge areas, there are 5 process groups, and the 49 processes are spread out across these processes and knowledge areas. So every process is aligned with one process group and one knowledge area. All right, so there also, if you have studied or are familiar with the PMBOK guide, you know that every process has a number of inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs. And so we have another document. It's out on the portal. You can look at it if you want to, but it's not necessary that you go to this level of detail. Remember, this exam is not getting as deep into the process discussion, so you don't have to be familiar with all the inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs of all the processes. And so instead, basically studying and memorizing all the ETOs, inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs, is not necessary for the current exam. What you do want to be familiar with is the high-level key inputs and outputs of the processes. These are inputs and outputs, but they're the inputs and outputs that really establish the connection or the main relationship between the processes. So those you need to be generally familiar with, but don't get into the weeds and know all the inputs, tools, and techniques and outputs. That's not necessary. Now, if you'll notice, this is basically what you're looking at is what we call our PMP Exam Prep process map. This is organized by process group, so you can see the larger process groups on the left side. You see at the top left corner, initiate, then you can see the 24 planning processes below that. Then, of course, you look on the right side, you'll see the executing processes, all 10 processes there. You look on the right side, and you'll see the monitoring control processes are listed there, which there are 12. And then if you go down below, you will see the one closing process. Add those together, and you come up with 49 processes. But it's important to understand which knowledge area you're in. And so you can see in the left side, middle of the top of the page there, they have the knowledge areas. And so the knowledge areas are listed there. There's 10 of them. Most of them are very intuitive, right? You understand what scope is, you know what schedule is, you know what cost and quality, resources, communication, risk, procurement, and stakeholder management. The question is integration management. A lot of people get stuck with integration management. And so just to give you a quick overview, a lot of people say integration management is what the project manager is doing, right? Those integration processes pretty much tie together the other knowledge areas. It's the processes to identify, define, combine, unify, and coordinate the project activity. So that's pretty much what project managers do to keep things moving together and seamlessly executing the project. Moving on, let's take a quick look at the initiating processes. In initiating, there's only 2 processes there, if you remember, and it starts with develop the project charter. And so develop the project charter creates a project charter, just like the name implies, which authorizes a project and gives authority to the project manager. After that, The project charter flows into the identify stakeholders process. At the beginning of the project, you have your project sponsor who's already assigned to the project. The project sponsor often will identify the project manager, and many times the project manager's name will be listed in this high-level project charter document. And then together you can imagine them sitting at a table or maybe on the stairs looking at this high-level document and saying, who would be impacted by this project? And they start creating that list of stakeholders that will be so important to the project as they start to call together and bring together workshops and start to collect requirements, identify risks and all. The stakeholder group is going to be critically important for all of the project planning and beyond. And so now we transition, once we're done with initiating, which is a short, simple process group, we go into planning processes. This is a big area. It's going to take a little while to work through these processes, but let's start from the beginning. Typically, you'll start with scope, right? You have your project objectives outlined in the project charter. You can see the charter is at the top of this diagram, and the charter is moving into these planning processes. And they start with the scope typically, because you have to understand what you're doing before you can determine, how long it's going to take, how much it's going to cost, what your quality requirements are, your resource requirements, etc. You got to start from the scope. So everything typically starts there, and you have to put together your planning document for scope. So most of these knowledge areas will start with a process that develops a component of the project management plan, and scope is where we'll begin. You can see this first process, plan scope management, creates the scope management plan. And that scope management plan basically guides you through the rest of the scope management processes. It guides you through collecting the requirements, right? We're getting groups of people together, stakeholders, bringing them into the room, collecting what their needs and wants are into requirement documentation. And then it's time to refine that scope and create a scope statement, which creates more precise boundaries around the scope, and you start to identify what's in scope and what's out of scope. Defined scope evaluates the project requirements and creates a more precise scope statement. So there's another important output, the scope statement. After that, we create the WBS. If you're familiar with what a WBS is, it's a work breakdown structure. So if you ever studied the PMBOK 6th edition, you're very familiar with the work breakdown structure, where you break high-level requirements that are in the scope statement down into more precise deliverables, ultimately till you get down to the work packages, the lowest level of the WBS. WBS is a graphical hierarchical presentation of the scope. You notice that defined scope gave us a scope statement, and then WBS gave us two more components, the WBS and the WBS dictionary. That collection of three items, the scope statement, WBS, and WBS dictionary, was enough to give us our scope baseline. And so the scope baseline is what we're going to ultimately commit to doing, and we're going to measure our performance, our scope performance, against that baseline going forward. So keep that in mind as we transition over to schedule management. We have a scope baseline, and now we need to transition into schedule management and see if we can create a schedule baseline. Then we move to plan schedule. That's where we create our schedule management plan. Okay, now we have our schedule management plan as an output, and that's the how-to document for how we're going to do schedule management and build the schedule for our project. We take the work packages that we finished out in scope management, we carry those over here, and we break those work packages down into more detailed activities. Sometimes we call them schedule activities because this is the form that they're going to take before we apply them to a schedule. And so we define those activities at that point. And before we can go to the next schedule management process, we have to understand what our resource requirements are. So you can see this next process here is estimate activity durations, but we can't estimate activity durations, right? We have our activities at this point. We can't estimate the activity durations because we have to first understand what our resources are on the activities. So a lot of us are familiar with estimating. When you're estimating the duration, question for everybody: can the resources or the number of resources you have on an activity influence the duration of an activity? Yes, absolutely. So we have to, before we can estimate durations, we have to say, well, how many people are available to do this activity? Because if I'm, for example, I like to use the example of stuffing envelopes, right? Or you can say something simple like, I've got someone, or our activity is eating gumdrops. If I have one person, it takes me 12 minutes. If I have two people, I can do it faster. I can do it in 6 minutes, right? And so we need to understand what resources are available. So before we go to estimate activity durations, we're going to jump over and we're going to do the resource planning. So first, before we can estimate activity resources, we have to finish our plan resource management process to create our resource management plan, and then we can get in and estimate activity resources. Now that we have activity resources estimated, right, now we can step into that process and estimate activity durations. And so now we finish that. Now we sequence the activities. We have the activity list, and you can see how the activity lists give us direction on each one of these activities, right? We need to know what the activities are in order to perform this work. So we get the duration estimates, when we sequence the activities. The key output of sequencing activities gives us our project schedule network diagrams, right? Because sequencing activities has to do with us understanding relationships between the activities. Which activity has to come first? Which one comes after? Once we determine that, we can start to draw that network diagram that really illustrates those relationships. That's important because all of this information that we're creating, the durations and network diagrams, are all going to be information that's necessary in order to develop the schedule. And so we pull all that information together and we develop the schedule, and ultimately you can see the key output of that is our schedule baseline. So that's our second baseline that we've built in planning. It's important to remember that there are really three key baselines that we need to develop in planning, and we've got two of them. So we need to go and find that last baseline for planning. And I'm going to clean it up a little bit so we can go on looking for that last one. Of course, as you may have imagined, the next logical step for us to go into cost management. So we have to come up with our cost management plan. And we have that first process that essentially tells us, this is how we're going to do the cost management processes. So we start there. We create our cost management plan that gives us guidance on how to do the rest of the cost management processes. And then we take those activity level estimates, or those activities, sometimes those work package, and we estimate those more precisely. So we estimate the costs, and then we move on with those cost estimates to aggregating or summarizing all those costs into a budget. You can see the key output of that process is our cost baseline. And so baselines are basically our commitments on the project. So we've created a scope baseline where it's outlined very specifically, this is what we're going to do, this is the scope we're going to accomplish. A schedule baseline says this is when we're going to do it, and a cost baseline says, and this is how much money we're going to spend along the way. And so we've gotten the three big baselines out of the way. Now the order of things is pretty much, in whatever order makes sense to you, right? The first three did make sense, and you had to kind of follow in that order. But after that, you can kind of take them in any order you want. So we're just going to go and say, let's now plan quality management. Let's evaluate and determine how we're going to build quality into the product or service, how we're going to measure quality. All that's determined in this process, and we could come out of this process with our quality metrics. What are metrics we need to achieve, and what is the plan for ensuring that we meet those quality standards? The next step, of course, is going up to plan communication management, and this creates the communication management plan. And that's the how-to document for communication on the project. The next step is to go into plan risk management. There's a lot of risk planning going on. You can see that how it tapers down, those gray boxes in the diagram. But it's all these knowledge areas start with a planning document. It's the how-to document on how we're going to perform the rest of these processes. So we come up with our risk management plan, and then very logically we perform the process of identifying those risks. What risks are we subject to, right? Always looking at the probability and the impact of those risks. Perform qualitative analysis. Qualitative analysis is about prioritizing. So we're calculating the probability, multiplying it against the impact, and coming up with a PIM score, probability impact matrix score. That will help us to prioritize the risks based on that PIM score. The next process is quantitative analysis. Sometimes people look at this diagram and think we've got a misprint because we got the same process name twice, but if you look closer, there's a subtle difference between those two. The qualitative risk analysis is about prioritization. Quantitative is assigning a numeric value, a dollar value, to the project risk. It requires much more data to do quantitative analysis. Okay? If you can get that, it's very helpful to have that, but that's something, sometimes projects just don't have enough data to do quantitative analysis, but they should always be able to accomplish qualitative analysis, right, to do the prioritization. Now, after you do your analysis, you're now in a position looking at the risks and their analysis results to plan your risk responses. What are you going to do about those risks? And that goes into your risk register. So your risk register lists your risks and all of the risk responses associated with those risks. Planned stakeholder engagement is the next step. It's not the same thing as communication. Stakeholder engagement is about how are we going to engage these stakeholders throughout the project so we remain aware of what their needs are. And so ultimately, this project will achieve something that's satisfying for our stakeholders. So we put together a plan, we do our stakeholder analysis, and then we put together a plan to how we're going to maintain that engagement with our key stakeholders throughout the project. We also plan procurement management. Now, plan procurement management is there's several processes in procurement, but one of the key ones for us is the first one, because in the first procurement process is where we look at our scope of our project, we look across the project and we say, is there anything in this project that we're going to do outside of the project team? Procurement activity may include buying just materials, maybe outsourcing a portion of the project to another entity so that they can perform the work because maybe it's a lower risk for them, they do it better than we do, so we're outsourcing it. But in this process, not only are we going to put together a plan for how we're going to do procurement, but we're going to ask that very important question. Is there anything that we want to procure? Because if there's not, we will not continue to the next procurement process, right? So make or buy analysis happens in this process. Now, ultimately, when all this work is done, all these outputs are achieved, then we have developed the project management plan. This is where we take all those components that we just talked about developing and combine them into one large, comprehensive project management plan that's going to guide us through the execution and the monitor and controlling processes. So if you look at it, everything's kind of driving down to this one process, the project management plan, and you can see the output project management plan is going to feed right into the next process group. If you're looking more specifically at the project management plan, just remember we said it's very important to know that the project management plan has 18 components. You also see the baseline. It's very important to realize that the scope baseline, schedule baseline, and cost baseline are part of the project management plan, but all these 18 components make up the comprehensive project management plan that drives the execution and controlling of the project. Okay. Inside of this view, you can see where those project management components were created. You saw a lot of the project processes across the top created a lot of the components of that project management plan, but you can see those make up a lot of the plans, and then of course you have your three baselines were also part of the plan. So if you added all those up, you would find all 18 components of your project management plan were created in these processes. Moving forward, one last thing. Remember we had a conversation about project documents. A lot of these documents are also referred to in the process map. You'll see some of them listed as either inputs or outputs of these processes. So be generally familiar with these documents. Don't memorize this list. That's not necessary. But if you see documents on this list that you're not familiar with, remember PMI regards these as best practice project documents that are used by organizations today. And so take a minute, go into the project documents definitions and have a look at those definitions to make sure you're just basically comfortable with what those documents are. And a lot of times if you read the definition, it's fairly intuitive as how those documents are used. Moving on, executing processes, and we'll move a little faster. We've gone through the big planning processes. So hopefully this is giving you a pretty good overview. This is a document you want to be familiar with, and so you want to be able to work through it and have a general understanding of the stuff I'm talking about now. And so when you start executing, we're just going to start in this process with the top. You see there in the middle, the project management plan is coming from the planning process and giving us guidance on how to do the executing processes. And so in this process, we'll just start basically with manage quality. You can see the definitions on the bottom right corner now. We have some more room there. It's a little easier to see the definition, but manage quality ensures the correct standards and procedures are used to achieve the required quality metrics. You remember quality metrics came from the planned quality management process. That was one of the key outputs. Now we're in here, and this process is about ensuring that quality is built into the product or service while we're building it. You may have heard this mantra, build quality in, don't inspect it in, because they've determined, a lot of the quality gurus, that hey, it's cheaper to build it in the first time than to send it down for the inspection, fail the inspection, get defects, and all the costs associated with having to deal with those defects. So the focus of this process is look at the quality metrics, make sure that they're incorporated into the product or service, so when you send it over to the quality inspection, which is on the other side over in monitor controlling, you will have fewer defects and less waste. You can see coming into this process, we have the resource process, acquire resources. In the previous planning process, we planned how we would manage resources. Now it's time to do, right? That's what executing is about. So we're now doing the process of acquiring resources. We're following the plan, and whatever the plan says about how do we acquire resources, whether we go outside the organization, go inside the organization, what's that selection process like? We put our team together. As you can see, moving down, and once we have our team, it's time to develop the team. Make sure they work well together. See if anybody has any training to shore up their skill set, so that they will be able to perform the work that they're expected to do on the project. And then ultimately, once the team is up to speed and performing the work, we want to be able to manage the team, right? That means maintain our existing performance, and if and when necessary, manage conflicts that may arise with the team. Executing processes, the order that they occur is not as dependent as we saw in planning. In planning, there is a certain sequence, particularly at the beginning, where we need to start with scope and then schedule and then cost and then on down. In executing, a lot of these activities are happening simultaneously, except for the resource management ones where we acquire and develop and manage the team. The others can be done in any sequence. And so we see in this one, managed communications, just basically just following the communication management plan that we created early in the planning process. How do we communicate to each other? Everybody's communication needs are different, so managed communication is about making it happen and doing it according to the communication management plan that we put together in planning. We also have implement risk responses. So you saw in planning, we put together the risk register, we did all the analysis, we came up with our responses. Now in executing, it's about doing, right? Let's implement those risk responses according to the risk response plan. Okay, we also are conducting procurements. Now assuming we're going to buy anything, right, in our project, and assuming we've made that, completed that make or buy analysis and decided to move forward with some procurement activities. Conducting procurements takes us all the way from the RFP, the request for proposal, all the way to a signed document. We're conducting procurements, we're going to bidders conferences, we're talking to the different sellers or vendors about what the requirements are, and we're accepting proposals and reviewing those proposals. Ultimately, we're selecting the sellers that we're going to use for the procurement activities and coming to an agreement on the contract. That's what we do in that process. And then we manage stakeholder engagement. We follow the plan that we put together when we plan stakeholder management. Now we're actually doing the plan. We're following through, executing that plan to maintain that engagement with the key stakeholders. Next step, direct and manage project work. This is an integration process. It's really important in that this is where the work happens, right? This is where the deliverable is created. Whether it's an insurance policy or a piece of software or whatever we're doing, the work happens here. And so this is an integration process. The project manager is heavily involved in this process, ensuring that the deliverable is created correctly. Okay, but you can see one of the key outputs of direct and managed project work is the issue log. If we are encountering any issues with the creation of this deliverable, you can see the deliverable is a really important output of this process. Whatever it is that we're creating for this project, this is the deliverable coming out of that process. Now we're not done. When we create that deliverable, it's just like that item coming off the conveyor belt for the first time, and it's gleaming and it's got steam rising off of it. Well, we don't put it in a package and send it to the customer yet because we still have some inspections to do of this deliverable, but it's still significant, right? And that we've created it, and that's a significant milestone for us. So direct and managed project work is generating that, and also you'll see an important line coming out of direct and managed project work, and that's WPD. Now you'll see some abbreviations down here at the bottom. So we have a few abbreviations in this diagram, but WPD stands for Work Performance Data. And data has an evolutionary process. First, when you're doing the work, you're generating raw data that comes out of those. How much things are costing, what percent complete are you with these activities. Now the data by itself is meaningless, right? It's just data, right? Now it becomes more meaningful when we take that data, the cost of materials and the percent complete of activities, and we start to send that data over to the monitor and control processes. Once we send it over to those processes will take that raw data and start to compare it against the baselines and what our plans said we were supposed to do, right? And they start to measure our performance. Each one of those processes over in monitor controlling has a different perspective. Some are saying, okay, how much are we actually spending compared to how much we should have spent, right? Those are the cost measurement processes. Schedule processes are saying, well, how far along are we in our schedule versus how far along should we be, right? And that's what all the monitor control processes are doing, taking that raw data coming out of execution and comparing it against the project plan documents. So very important output of this process. All right, continuing, as you see, also this next process is managing project knowledge. So there used to be this kind of idea that you'd have lessons learned at the end of the project, and you would collect that, and it would help you on future projects. Well, PMI is definitely emphasizing now that lessons learned is not just something you do at the end of the project, it's something you manage throughout the project to help you on the current project and on future projects. So as you're doing the work, as you're generating the deliverable, you see the deliverable coming out and actually cycling into that process as well. You're looking at the deliverable and saying, what are we learning from that? And we document those lessons learned into a common repository that's available to us on the current project and certainly on future projects. And that is executing. Executing is going to now transition over to monitor and controlling. And so in monitor controlling, one of the things that we've already had some conversations about monitor controlling, but this is where we're measuring our performance. We're always comparing what we said we were going to do in the plan with what is actually happening in execution. And so you see control scope. Control scope is just about looking at the plan scope and seeing how we're performing against that. So you remember the work performance data, you see that coming out of execution. We're getting information from the executing processes saying what scope items have been completed. And we can compare that and see if in fact we're finishing the scope that we should have finished at this point in the project. Okay. After that, we have another scope process called validate scope. This one's a little bit different. Control scope is measuring us as we go through the project. Validate scope is something that we use to measure at the very end just to make sure that scope has been completed. And so one of them is where, for example, you have the foreman on the construction site going out every other day with the house plans and inspecting the houses to make sure everything that should have been done at that point in time is done. Where a validate scope is the final walkthrough, where the young couple walk through the house and inspect the final finished product to see if it's everything they asked for, right? That's the difference between those two processes. We have schedule processes that measure our performance in our schedule. We also see cost processes that measure our performance against our budget. We have quality processes that measure our performance against our quality, right? This is the quality inspection. We build quality in, and then we inspect to see if, in fact, we achieve the level of quality we should have achieved, right? And so we see a lot of communication between manage quality and control quality. We also are inspecting our resource utilization. A lot of times this process focuses more on our physical resources. Are we in fact utilizing the resources the way we said we were going to utilize resources when we put our planning document together? And then of course monitor communications. In our communication management plan, we specified this is how we're going to communicate. During executing, we did our communication. Now this process is saying, okay, are we in fact communicating and actually communicating the way we said we're going to communicate? And if not, we're going to identify variances in our performance and, if necessary, take action to try and eliminate those variances. So that's where change requests come in. We'll talk about that in just a second. But then, of course, we have monitor risks. This is about more monitoring to see if, in fact, are risks materializing, right? Because risks are things that haven't happened yet. They're things that have a probability, things that we keep an eye out for, things that we try and mitigate the impact of, but they haven't happened yet. Monitoring risk is about looking out there, seeing if anything is materializing, and are our responses still sufficient? Do we need to put more money aside? Do we need to find a different contingency plan because the risk has gotten larger since the last time we looked at it? Keep in mind that risk identification is an ongoing process. It's not a one-time event because risks change and increase and decrease over time. And so we're constantly monitoring risks and performing this process throughout the project. Also, we're monitoring stakeholder engagement. Again, are we in fact engaging stakeholders the way we said we're going to engage them? And if not, if we identify a variance or gap between what we said we're going to do, our plan, and what's actually happening, then we try and eliminate that gap. We try and improve the engagement to meet our original plan. We also control procurements. So control procurements is what we do after we have the signed contract. We've signed the contract, we have an agreement, and now we're measuring the performance of the vendor against the terms of the contract. Very simple, straightforward process. And so where we have baselines that we measure our performance against, in procurement we have the terms of the contract that we measure our performance against. And so that's what's happening in that process. We also have monitor and control project work. You'll notice the work performance data is feeding into those monitor control processes from the execution process. That raw data is coming into many of those measurement processes. And you notice on the other side, the output of those measurement processes is what we call work performance information. There's a big difference between data and information. Data is just what it is, data, and it feed that in, and then once that data is compared against the plan, what we said we needed to do, we're starting to determine how we're performing in all those various different areas of the project. And it comes out the other side as work performance information. Information is just what it says. It's informative. It tells us if we're performing according to the plan, we're underperforming or overperforming. And so we take that important information on performance and we feed that into this process. And in that process is where we where we summarize that information into work performance reports, and that are now in a format that we can send out to the stakeholders and say, here's how the project is going. So work performance information is important. It's often a little bit more cryptic. It's maybe written in project management language like CPI and SPI, but then we translate those cryptic performance numbers into more meaningful language like we're 3 days ahead of schedule or we're $10,000 over budget, into language that stakeholders can understand, and put that into the reports that get distributed to the stakeholder community. You can see the output there. Work performance reports feed over to our managed communication process, which is a process that basically is the communication arm. It's the muscle. It's the part that sends those work performance reports out to the stakeholder community. And it sends them out according to the communication management plan, however it says to do that. And so that's an important relationship you see in those with those documents. At the bottom, you'll see a very important process: perform integrated change control, and that's where all change requests go. Monitor control process group produces many change requests. Just it's kind of natural when you're comparing things. You identify gaps in performance. Many times the output of those processes is a change request to try and eliminate that variance and improve performance. But change requests can come in many different areas of the project, but they all go to this one process. That's why they call it integrated, because it's integrating all aspects of the project. Anywhere change requests are coming from, they'll funnel into this process right here, where they're evaluated by a change control board and either approved or rejected, and then they come out. If they're approved, they come out as approved change requests, and then those approved change requests will turn into additional work that will, then you'll go back to the planning and incorporate that work into your project plan, and ultimately it'll flow down into your execution processes again. There's a lot of communication between executing and monitor controlling. I talked about some of those things. We talked about the work performance data, right? How it comes over and makes a circle, and eventually you see how work performance reports go back to the executing processes to be communicated. We see a communication between managed quality and control quality. And we see change requests coming from many different parts of execution and ultimately flowing down into that process there. And closing, to finish it up, there's only one closing process. As we said before, projects can be made up of multiple phases, or they can have one phase. But either way, if it's the end of a phase, you're going to perform closing for that phase. If it's the last phase in a project, you're going to be performing closing for the project. And so closing really involves closing all the project activity to formally complete the project or phase. So closing usually involves verifying the scope items are complete, right? Making sure everything's accounted for. You don't want to release resources from your project before they have finished their work. So you want to make sure the scope items are completed, and if all the scope items are done, then you can release any remaining resources that are still in your project. You can tell them they can go now, and then it's a good time to perform any lessons learned, and then store project documentation. Storing away project documentation is a critical step for the project.